Welcome to another lecture by MedicoMedics, Learning Made Easy, Anatomy Chapter 8, the Endocrine System. In this lecture, we will focus on the functions of the endocrine system. We will discuss hormones and their mechanisms of action, mention the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, the thyroid and the parathyroid glands. Furthermore, we will talk about the adrenal glands, the pancreas, our gonads, and mention some common endocrine disorders, some common diagnostic tools, and end with a summary. Now, what are some functions of the endocrine system? First of all, it's involved in regulating growth and development, in maintaining homeostasis, like blood sugar levels and our metabolism. It controls reproduction and sexual function. It is involved in coordinating the body's stress response. Now let's begin with an overview of the endocrine system. So it consists of glands that secrete hormones into the bloodstream. The major glands include the hypothalamus, the pituitary glands, the thyroid, the parathyroid, the adrenal gland, pancreas, and the gonads that are our ovaries, and for men, testes. Now, hormones act on target cells via specific receptors. And here in this illustration here, you can see of the brain, this is where we find structures like the hypothalamus, and sitting under it, we have the pituitary gland. Now, hormones and their mechanism of action. So we have different types of hormones. We have, for example, steroid hormones like cortisol and estrogen. They are lipid soluble and act on intracellular receptors. We have peptide hormones like insulin and growth hormones. These are water soluble and act on cell surface receptors. Now, what's the mechanism here? Well, they bind to receptors either on or in target cells. They trigger a cascade of biochemical reactions, and they maintain balance through something called negative feedback. Now let's start with the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus connects the nervous system and the endocrine system. It produces, releasing, and inhibiting hormones. Now, the pituitary gland has two lobes. So we have the anterior lobe that produces growth hormone, GH, prolactin, ACTH, which stands for adrenocorticotropic hormone. We have TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. We have FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. And we have LH, luteinizing hormone. Then we have the posterior lobe, which releases oxytocin, and ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone. And these are produced in the hypothalamus. So what to remember right now is that these two systems are interacting very closely to one another. The hypothalamus sits above it, above the pituitary gland, and then we have the pituitary gland cut into the anterior side and the posterior lobe. And important to know is that they produce and release different types of hormones. Now let's continue to the thyroid and the parathyroid glands. So the thyroid gland produces thyroxine, also known as T4, and triiodothyronine, T3. These are mainly involved in regulating our metabolism. Furthermore, it is involved in the production of something called calcitonin, which is involved in lowering blood calcium levels. Contrary to that, we have the parathyroid glands. These produce parathyroid hormone, PTH, and these are involved in increasing blood calcium levels. And if you look at this illustration right here, you can see the thyroid sitting here, and it actually sits in front of your windpipe. So your trachea runs behind it. And what is very distinctive for the thyroid gland is that it looks like it has a butterfly-looking shape. And the parathyroid glands are actually four small structures sitting on, two of them sitting on each side of this butterfly-looking thing. Now moving on to the adrenal glands, a very fascinating structure. So the adrenal gland sits above your kidney or on top of your kidneys. So you can guess that you have two of these since you have two kidneys. Now, the adrenal gland is divided into the adrenal cortex, which is the outer layer, and the adrenal medulla, that is the inner layer. Now, the adrenal cortex further divides into three different zones, each of these with specific hormone production. And if you're studying or preparing for your exams, this is quite high yield. So first we have the zona glomerulosa. That's the outermost layer. This is where mineral corticoids are produced, like aldosterone. And aldosterone regulates sodium and potassium balance. So this is involved in affecting our blood pressure levels. In the middle layer, we will find the zona fasciculata. This is where glucocorticoids are produced, like cortisol, involved in regulating our metabolism, very involved in our stress response, and involved in inflammation. And the innermost layer is zona reticularis. This is where androgens are produced. So these are precursors to sex hormones like testosterone and estrogen. Now, the adrenal medulla is made of specialized chromaffin cells. And the adrenal medulla is where catecholamines are produced. So epinephrine and norepinephrine, crucial in our fight or flight response. And here in this illustration, you can actually see the release of catecholamines from the adrenal medulla, leading to these different effects. For example, vasoconstriction, increased blood pressure and heart rate, glycogenolysis. All of these are involved in our sympathetic nervous system activation. Moving on then to the pancreas. So the pancreas is both an endocrine and an exocrine organ. So its exocrine function is what? Well, it produces digestive enzymes. These are amylase, lipase, proteases, and even bicarbonate. And these act on the small intestine via different ducts to aid in digestion. So you can remember exocrine, digestion. Now, the endocrine part of it produces hormones like insulin, glucagon, somatostatin, etc. And these are produced from the islands of Langerhans. Now, these are released into the bloodstream to regulate blood sugar and metabolism. So let's go a bit deeper into this endocrine function. So if you look at this illustration here of the pancreas, you see here towards its tail that we have these islets of Langerhans. And here you can see the four different cells we mentioned here that exist within these islets. Now, each of these have different products with different effects. So, for example, the beta cells produce insulin, and these are involved in lowering blood glucose, so blood sugar levels, by promoting glucose uptake and storage. We have alpha cells. These produce glucagon. These are involved in raising blood glucose by stimulating glycogen breakdown and something called gluconeogenesis. Furthermore, a bit less known, we have delta cells. These produce somatostatin that inhibits insulin secretion, glucagon secretion, and other digestive hormones. We have these F cells, or PP cells, And these produce pancreatic polypeptide. These are involved in regulating pancreatic enzyme secretion and influences our gastrointestinal function. So in the big picture, the pancreas regulates blood sugar levels mainly to maintain our homeostasis. Now moving to gonads, so the ovaries and testes. Now, in our ovaries, we find the production of estrogen and progesterone. These are crucial in regulating the menstrual cycle and support during pregnancy. In the testes, we find the production spot of testosterone. This is the testes are involved in regulating sperm production and male secondary sexual characteristics. So here you have two anatomical illustrations here, one of the female reproductive system and one of the male reproductive system. So in the female, we find here the most common things that you do need to know in an initial anatomy course. So we have the entrance here via the vagina, we have the cervix here. Furthermore, we have the fallopian tubes. We have the ovaries, the ovarian ligament. We have the fundus. And we have a lot more structures here, like the endometrium, and of course the uterus itself. And what about the male reproductive system? So we have the testes, we have the epididymis, a well-known vas deferens, we have the prostate glands, we have the seminal vesicles, we have the urethra, etc. Now, some common endocrine disorders. So we have, first and foremost, maybe the most famous one, which is diabetes mellitus, whereby there is insufficient insulin production or action. Now, you may probably already know that diabetes is put in different types. So we have type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, we even have type 3 diabetes. Most commonly, type 1 and type 2. And what differentiates them mainly is that in type 1 diabetes, we mentioned the beta cells of the pancreas producing insulin. Patients who have type 1 diabetes do not have production of insulin, so they are insulin depleted. And the treatment then would probably, indeed, you've probably guessed it, to give them insulin. But in type 2 diabetes, the patient may actually have insulin, maybe not at levels necessary to maintain homeostasis, but the problem is here is more likely problems with resistance. So there may be insulin, but when insulin is binding to receptors for glucose to be able to enter into our cells, there may be issues with these receptor functions, etc., etc. So we give medications to help out and decrease this resistance for easier insulin uptake and glucose uptake. Furthermore, we have hypothyroidism. So this is when you have low thyroid hormone levels. A famous one is Hashimoto's thyroiditis. We have hyperthyroidism, where we have excess thyroid hormone levels, like in Graves' disease. Moving on to our adrenal glands, we have Cushing's syndrome, where we have an excess production of cortisol. Another one is Addison's disease, where we have insufficient adrenal hormone production. So you can already see a lot of the different organs in our body responsible for different common disorders. So mainly the pancreas would be correlated to diabetes mellitus, the thyroid to hypothyroidism and hyperthyroidism. Naturally, other structures are, of course, involved. When we talk about the thyroid, we almost always talk about its relation to the pituitary gland, the hypothalamus, etc. They rarely work in isolation. However, if they do, we can correlate the thyroid to these two, pancreas to this one, and the adrenal glands to these two. Now, in our course library, we have all of these different disorders and many, many more involved in endocrine, part of endocrine disorders, as individual lectures where we go into much more detail of each one. So make sure to look at those. Now then, some common diagnostic tools we use. So we do blood tests to measure hormone levels like thyroid stimulating hormone, cortisol, insulin, imaging like CT or MRI for gland abnormalities, glucose tolerance tests to assess insulin function, biopsy for gland tumors or nodules. So in summary then, the endocrine system regulates critical functions through hormone production. Glands work in coordination to maintain homeostasis and respond to stress. Hormone imbalances can lead to significant clinical conditions. Diagnostics and treatment targets gland function and hormone regulation. And that's the end of Chapter 8. Move now to Chapter 9.